I was about 10 years old, I started going to my grandparents' house after school on weekdays because of my parents' work schedules. My dad was a private contractor for the military and would travel all over East Texas for work. He would be gone for weeks at a time and was never able to really talk much about what he did or where he was going, not to me anyway. My mom was a waitress and worked in the evenings, so she would take me to school in the morning, then pick me up at my grandparents' house around 10 p.m. after the restaurant closed. Another thing I want to note before I get into it is that my grandpa spent a quarter of his life as a fighter pilot in the Air Force. His time in the service, along with his connections, were the reason my dad got into working with the military, and the two of them would do a lot of work together. One summer while on break, I was spending full days at their house, usually from around lunchtime until late at night while my mom worked. I'll never forget one afternoon shortly after I had gotten to their house, we had the most unusual visitor. I was sitting in the living room and watching TV when someone knocked on the front door. I yelled to my grandma that someone was there, then she came out from the kitchen, opened the curtain on the front window to see who it was, and I remember seeing a black sedan parked in the driveway. I don't know what kind of car it was, but it looked like something big and American. What's strange is I didn't hear a car pull up even though I had been sitting right next to the window. My grandma opened the door, and to the best of my memory, the man introduced himself as some kind of salesman who needed to speak with my grandpa. She politely invited him in and called for my grandpa, and that's when I saw him clearly for the first time. I had never seen anyone like him in my entire life. He was so pale and dressed in an all black or maybe a very dark blue suit with a matching hat and oversized sunglasses. I remember thinking that the sunglasses were the kind you might see on a blind person. Underneath his hat was the saddest excuse for a toupee that I have ever seen, and it was sitting crooked on his head like he'd just tossed it on without looking in the mirror. It was so obviously fake that I even noticed it as a kid. When my grandpa came in, they sat down and started talking right away. I was completely transfixed on the guy, and my staring must have been obvious because my grandma shooed me into the kitchen and told me to let the men talk. After I'd gone into the kitchen, I couldn't help it and I kept sneaking around the corner to look at him and listen. At one point, I remember whispering to my grandma and asking her if he was sick because of how he looked. Another weird thing I didn't think about until later on was that my grandpa didn't even introduce himself. They had just sat down and started talking like they already knew each other. I couldn't hear most of what they said, but I am absolutely certain that I heard my dad's name mentioned several times during the conversation. I didn't think much of it then, but looking back now, it had to have been related to the work that my dad and grandpa did together. They talked for quite a while, then eventually I heard my grandpa get up and walk him to the door, which then made my grandma go out to say goodbye as the man was leaving. None of them knew that I could still partially see into the living room, but when my grandma got close to the door, I saw the guy do something so bizarre it burned into my memory forever. I watched him pass one of his hands right in front of my grandma's face, probably only an inch away from it. Then he said something to her, but I couldn't hear what it was. On his way out, he addressed my grandpa as sir, then walked out to his car. When I came back into the living room, my grandma closed the door and stood there for a second looking blank. Then she went back into the kitchen and my grandpa went out to the garage, and neither one of them said anything to me. It wasn't until right before dinner time when I was helping her set the table that I finally asked who the man was. She looked at me and actually asked, "What man?" Even at 10 years old, I knew something was wrong with that. She seemed genuinely confused by my question, like she had no memory of anyone coming to the house that day. It really bothered me because I couldn't understand how she could forget someone like that. This guy was a borderline circus character. I kept asking about it for weeks to the point they were getting annoyed. Finally, my grandpa got fed up with it and told me I was mixing things up with a business friend who had dropped by. I knew better than to argue with him, but I wasn't mixing anything up. There was no way anyone could have confused that man with someone else. Life went on after that. I grew up and I almost forgot about it until years later when I saw a show on the Sci-Fi Channel about Men in Black. This was about the real stories though, not the movie characters. As I was watching it, everything came flooding back to me. After seeing that show, everything changed, and I am now convinced the guy I saw was some form of the Men in Black. With my grandpa's career in the military and my dad's contract work with them, it really makes total sense to me. The only thing I can't figure out is why the guy looks so weird. I'm not exaggerating when I say he was like a walking cartoon character. Even as recently as last year, I brought it up with my grandma when we were visiting for the holidays. My grandpa is no longer with us, but my grandma, now 96 years old and doing surprisingly well, still has no memory of anything happening that day. The only thing she does remember is me pestering her about it for weeks when I was a kid. This all took place in the mid-1980s and I'm now nearly 50, so I'm not expecting to ever find out who he was or what was going on. Some of the details aren't as sharp as they used to be, but I know what I saw, and it's just as confusing to me today as it was when it happened. My name is Daniel Price, and this happened when I was 14 years old in the summer of '97. Our youth group went on a camping trip during the last week of summer break to the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. We left on a Thursday and it was a 3-night trip until Sunday. The itinerary was team building and hiking in the mornings, some free time and water activities at Lake Ouachita midday, and Bible study in the evenings. There were around 25 of us total, about 10 adult leaders and chaperones, and the rest teenagers in the youth group. The boys and girls were in completely separate areas. Where I was in the boys' area, they had 2 large canvas tents set up, each big enough to walk around in with several cots laid out. Inside with me were Deacon Bennett, who was our adult chaperone, and 4 other boys. The first day was mostly travel and setup. We got to the campground in the afternoon, unloaded everything from the church van and trailer, then set up the tents in the cooking area. After dinner that night, we had a short Bible study around the fire pit, then everybody went to their tents. I remember it was around 10 p.m. when we got in our cots. That very first night, long after I had fallen asleep, something woke me up. Our tent was dark except for the light from the moon outside. Right away, I saw a figure standing inside of our tent. Normally, I would have been petrified by seeing this, but for some reason I wasn't. I just watched it. It seemed somewhat tall but could still stand up under the tent roof, and it started moving slowly around the tent. I watched it walk to each person sleeping, lean over them, stay there for a few seconds, then move on to the next person. Whatever this was started at Mr. Bennett, then it went on to the other boys in our tent. I still wasn't scared by this in any way, and if I had any feelings at all, I would say I was curious. When this figure got to me, I still couldn't see who or what it was, but it leaned over me and placed one of its hands on my chest, which I felt just as solid and real as if anyone were to put their hand on your chest. As soon as that happened, I woke up again. This time it was morning. It was such a strange experience, and I kept totally quiet about it the whole day. I convinced myself it had to have been a dream because no one else had even mentioned it. On the second night, the exact same thing happened. I woke up and saw the figure, then I watched it walk to each person in the same order. Then again, when it got to me, it leaned over, put its hand on my chest, and I woke up. For the second time, I had no fear about what was happening, and I found that to be so weird. Whatever was going on just didn't have a bad or malevolent feeling in any way. I would just lie there in my cot, calm as could be, and watching it. On our last night, which would have been Saturday night, it was the same thing. That night I was almost expecting it, and it happened exactly as before. By then I was certain I was having a recurring dream, which actually made me more calm and almost happy to see it happen again, as weird as that sounds. I didn't say anything to anyone about it until we were driving home on Sunday afternoon. I was sitting in the far back seat of the van next to a friend of mine, and I asked him if he saw anyone come into our tent at any time during any of the 3 nights. He told me no, not once, and that was the end of the conversation, so I concluded that it had to have been a dream. Surprisingly, the weird part of all of this didn't even start until the week after we got back. It was the first week back at school, and I was sitting in the hallway next to the cafeteria during lunch when out of nowhere, I had the most intense déjà vu I would think you could ever experience. Everything around me felt like it had happened before. The sound of my friend unzipping his backpack, the way the sunlight was coming in the window and hitting the tile floor, even the subtle movement of someone's shoelace moving as they walked past us. It was incredibly intense and shocking, and it went on for so much longer than it normally would. I even said déjà vu out loud to my friends, and that too felt like I had said it before in the exact same moment. When it finally ended, I had to sit there for a minute to shake it off. Over the next few days, it happened again and again, and on one of the days, it happened to me 4 times. Each one of these episodes was just as intense and long-lasting as the first one. I swear it got to the point where I could almost predict what was about to happen around me while I was in it. In total, I think it happened about 30 times during that first week back at school. I have no idea why, but by the following Monday after the weekend, the déjà vu abruptly stopped, but then it was replaced by something else. Every single night during the second week back at school, right as I was about to fall asleep, I would have these crystal clear visions. I knew I wasn't dreaming yet because it would happen while I was still getting comfortable and trying to fall asleep. When this would happen, I would suddenly be back at our youth group camp but looking at it from a distance, almost like I was standing maybe 50 yards away from the campsites but in the trees. Then, directly above our camp, I would see a huge and dark craft slowly coming down from the sky. This thing was massive too, easily the size of a building, and I would see it stop and hover above where our tents were. That's when I would snap out of it, open my eyes for a second and wonder why I was seeing that, then fall asleep again like normal. These visions went on for almost 2 full weeks every single night, and then after that it stopped too. Those series of events are the only unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me, and I still don't know what it was. Back then, I used to think it was spiritual and that the figure in the tent was some kind of ghost or demon trying to manipulate our church group, but I think that was just my teenage brain going to the only thing I was taught. Looking back on it as an adult though, there was never even a hint of evil or fear or anything like that, so I don't really think that anymore. To me, it almost felt like we were being checked on or studied in some way. I don't know why, but maybe I was able to hang on to a few fragments or memories of what happened. Between seeing the figure in our tent 3 nights in a row, then the déjà vu and the visions of watching this giant craft hover over our camp, I can't help but think we all experienced something, but apparently I was the only one who remembered. This took place in the 60s in outback New South Wales, Australia. From memory, it was about autumn and before the cold set in. My brother Pete used to take regular fishing trips to a branch of the Darling River about 100 kilometers from our town, Broken Hill. He did this trip at least once a month and would always bring back a bag of yabbies and a few fish. On his last trip, he took his girlfriend for company. They left in the early morning and would normally return by late afternoon, but on this occasion it had already gotten dark and my mom, my dad, and I were sitting down for dinner. I remember my parents starting to get a little worried that he wasn't back yet. Finally, Pete, who was about 23 years old at the time, came bursting through the door and his hair was quite literally standing on end. He was visibly trembling, his eyes were bugging out, and his face was so pale it looked like paper. He was also talking so fast that we couldn't even understand what he was saying. Eventually, he got his breath back and was able to tell us what had happened. During their drive home on Menindee Road, which is a completely empty 110-kilometer stretch between Broken Hill and Menindee, they had been followed to the outskirts of town by a large and extremely bright disc-shaped object. Initially, he thought it was a road train coming up behind him, which is what we call a multi-trailered large truck in Australia. But as it got closer, he could see that it wasn't the typical set of 4 lights and spotlights. It was just a single complete light. Pete said he couldn't actually see the details of the craft because of how alarmingly bright it was, but the span of the light covered both sides of the road and then about 3 meters beyond the sides of the road on either side. It would be behind him, then above the car, and even along the sides where it was close to going in front of him. There were a few times where he actually thought he might collide with the thing, and the light it was emitting was so bright it made it hard to see where he was going. He estimated that it followed them for at least a half an hour, doing these maneuvers and staying close to the car the entire time. He also said it was a miracle they didn't crash the car because of how fast he'd been driving. The more he told us about it, the more visibly rapid his breathing became. I had never seen anyone so upset, let alone my easygoing brother. By the time they reached the edge of town, the craft had finally let up and stopped chasing them. The first thing he did was stop at the police station to report what had happened, but that turned out to be pointless because all they did was take a few notes and look at him like he was crazy. The entire experience was very traumatic for both of them, and his girlfriend was still shaken up by the whole thing when she came to the house again days later. No one in our family had ever really believed in UFOs or aliens or anything that couldn't be explained. Maybe because we just didn't think about things like that, but after that day, we really did look at the world in a whole new way. Pete sadly passed away just over 10 years ago at 68 years old, but he always maintained that he'd had an encounter with alien beings. In all the years afterward, not a single piece of his story ever changed. In fact, you could still see the terror in his eyes anytime he retold the story, even decades after it happened. He was always such a laid-back, easygoing guy and was never the type for pulling pranks or stunts, so we all believed him 100%. He would never make up such an incredible and detailed story, and even if he had tried to, he could never convincingly pull it off and act it out like he did. Whatever happened to them on that drive home was real, and no one could convince me otherwise.